For such a renowned intellectual, James had a curious obsession with Satanism and witchcraft. In 1597, he published a remarkable tract on demonology, which laid out all of his strange ideas about sorcery, witches, and witchcraft. It was kind of like James's Mein Kampf, I suppose. You know, like just replace the word Jews with witches and you've pretty much got it, you know. James liked to blame everything on witches in the same way that the Tory government liked to blame everything on poor people and immigrants. The publication of his tract in 1597 led to a satanic panic, which would be an amazing name for a heavy metal band, that, wouldn't it? 400 people were tried as witches in Scotland in the year 1597, and in total over 4,000 people would be tried as witches in Scotland. That's far, far larger than the number in neighbouring England that has 10 times the population. It was the highest number in Europe. So many people were dying because of our world-beating witch track and trace app. Such was James's obsession with witches that when he inherited the throne of England in 1603, William Shakespeare, he included the witches in the play Macbeth to try and appeal to the king. It was the whole reason he was writing a play about Scotland and James's supposed ancestors. Although I personally don't think that Macbeth is that Scottish at all. Do you know what I mean? Like, Shakespeare doesn't use the C word once. You know, if it really is the Scottish play, then Macbeth would be cunt of cod or cunt of glamis and cunt thereafter, you know? And James's obsession with witches can be traced back to 1589 and his new bride, Princess Anne of Denmark. Anne was trying to sail to Scotland when her ship was hit by severe storms. She was blown off course and forced to take shelter in a Norwegian fjord. Now, if she'd been shipwrecked in Sweden, she'd have sheltered in a Volvo, not a fjord. Anyway, the Danish admiral who was in charge of the fleet, he was convinced that the storm's been caused by witches. An admiral who blamed weather on witches and not North sea conditions. Donald Trump would 1,000,000% have made that guy the head of the Navy, wouldn't he? And so James, he goes over to Norway to rescue his stranded bride in October 1589. And he spends the next 6 months travelling the court of his brother-in-law, Christian IV. And while he's travelling, they're debating a lot of different topics, including witches and sometimes Doctor Who as well. And when James and Anne return to Scotland in the spring of 1590, their ship is battered by severe storms, which James blames on witches. An investigation is launched, and 100 people are tried, tortured, and some of them are executed from the East Lothian seaside town of North Berwick. Now, these witches, they came from a range of different backgrounds. One was a schoolmaster, one was the wife of an Edinburgh burgess, one was the daughter of a judge, one was a midwife. They were very middle-class witches. You know, I mean, they were from North Berwick after all. Presumably the main ingredient in their cauldron was avocado, you know? And they were accused of congregating at St Andrew's Kirk, where they then dug up dead bodies, cut off their limbs, tied them to cats, and then hurled them into the North Sea. Which is obviously plainly ridiculous. You know, if you're going to use cats to create a storm, you would go for thundercats, wouldn't you? And they were subjected to horrific torture techniques. They would use things like scald's bridles. These were like big iron helmets with prongs that would protrude at the mouth and hold the tongue in place, making it impossible to move your head or to open your mouth. They would use breast rippers, which unfortunately do exactly as it says in the tin, ladies. Thumb screws, and pretty much anything from Christian Grey's Red Room to elicit a confession. But their main torture method they would use was sleep deprivation. They would keep people alive for days upon end, at which point they would make delirious confessions about driving to check if they were blind, you know. And James, he took a keen interest in the North Berwick witch trials, and at the beginning he was pretty sceptical until the trial of Agnes Sampson. And Agnes was able to tell James of events from his wedding night that only he could know. Whatever she said convinced him of her satanic credentials. Like, it must have been anal, right? It must have been. I feel like anyone could guess a couple of pumps, fall asleep, you know. Like, and so James, after the trial of Agnes Sampson, he was convinced in witchcraft. Agnes, she was strangled and then burnt at the stake, and it's said that her bald, tormented ghost still haunts the halls of Holyrood Palace to this day. Although it should be noted that most of the sightings of Agnes Sampson at Holyrood do tend to coincide with when Prince Philip is staying there. So I don't know if folk are just getting a wee bit mixed up, you know. And so why was James so utterly obsessed with witches? Well, as already mentioned, he'd been influenced by his Danish in-laws, but James, he also had a very difficult relationship with women, and most accused witches were women. From a young age, James had been poisoned against his mother, constantly told that Mary was a murderous Catholic whore, and he had been brought up to be the very antithesis of Mary, a miserable, boring bastard, basically. James was also suppressing his sexuality. He was almost certainly gay and quite literally was living a lie. He literally preferred the company of men. But it should be noted as well that Scotland at the end of the 16th century, going into the 17th century, was a hyper-religious place. Extreme Protestant preachers were using very literal interpretations of the Bible, which allowed them to then claim that women were weaker, that they were more easily influenced by the temptations of the devil because, for example, of Eve in the Garden of Eden. But I mean, that's just plainly ridiculous. You know, the only reason it was Eve that took the apple in the Garden of Eden is because it's a fucking apple. See if that snake, right, had offered an egg roll and a packet of McCoys, Adam would have snapped his hand off. I can assure you that, you know. So James was convinced that they were plotting and conspiring against him, when in truth, women just didn't like him. And so all of this panic that would come in Scotland, all of these thousands of people's lives who would be lost over the 17th century in particular, they can be traced back to the beginnings of James VI's rule. So thousands of people died because of this one guy, because of this one insipid, sweaty, balding, misogynistic, xenophobic, orange, small-handed, pussy-grabbing prick of a king. But it's it's really difficult to find any kind of 21st century context for you guys. Very, very difficult. And the Scottish Parliament, they've described the murder of witches as legalised murder. There's never been any formal apology from the government. There's no national witchcraft memorial or anything like that. There is a well on the castle esplanade outside Edinburgh Castle, which marks the spot where witches were burned at the stake. They put a well on the spot where people were burned at the stake. It was put there in 1912, the same year the Titanic sunk, which they presumably would have wanted to commemorate by building a great big fucking lifeboat. And with Scotland looking at our unsavoury past and links to slavery and statues and street names, it's probably about time that we take responsibility and apologise for the deaths of those thousands and thousands of mainly innocent women. Anyway, I'm going to speak to you guys about James VI and the Union of the Crowns next time. Thank you so much for listening.